Hello, Shakespeare II. I'm Ileana Martinez. I hope you guys are all surviving your finals week. I know I'm trying my hard to survive finals. You guys are actually seeing my messy room right now because it is finals week and there's so much to take care of right now. So let's get into it. For my research paper, I picked, my topic was sex and Shakespeare. I wanted to do a comparison between the two genres, which are comedies and tragedies. For comedy, I picked Measure for Measure, and for tragedies, I picked Othello and Hamlet. I wanted to point out the comparisons and the contrast between those comedies and tragedies, those two genres. So I'm going to take you into a little journey before we get into the comparisons and contrast, which is a history of the sexual activity in London and Stratford upon Avon. And then also we'll look into the comparisons and contrast, and then later on, since English English is very subjective and sometimes Shakespeare's work is very open to interpretation, I will show you the sexual interpretations that film and theater directors took. So let's get started on this journey, shall we? As I researched, I found that Shakespeare was surrounded by sex in London. Much of the punishments that took place were similar to the ones in his works, and reading in my sources, other famous writers at the time were heavily influenced by the pleasures and punishments of sex during that time. Before I go on further with the similarities and the contrasts to Shakespeare's work within the two genres, I wanted to touch bases on the influence that sex had during his lifetime and how much it affected his imagination. So, during the Elizabethan era and the reign of King James, sex and the attitudes towards it were really different from our time. Elizabethans were well accustomed to being told how wicked they were, and the church, along with the government, took the lead to regulate the citizens of London. According to Stanley Wells, author of Shakespeare's Sex and Love, he mentions that the church and the government tried this massive legislation designed to demonstrate the teachings of the Holy Bible and to punish offenders, often with like a severe and brutal way that shocked civilized societies, even of civilized societies of today. So Stanley Wells mentions how the government and the church tried to involve themselves in people's sex lives, such as they would actually tell people how to have sex, and they would say that the missionary position would be the best way to have a healthy child, and they would actually punish people if they found out if they had premarital sex or if they had sex outside of a marriage, such as adultery, having an affair. With all of this occurring in the region, Shakespeare and various writers were influenced by their surroundings to write about the controversy and pleasures of sex. And even then, public figures such as Queen Elizabeth and King James were reflected into Shakespeare's plays as well. The purity of the Virgin Queen, that being Elizabeth, and the scandalous gossip that circulated England of King James were often brought into Shakespeare's comedies and plays. We first start off with Measure for Measure. This is one of Shakespeare's comedic and witty plays that definitely had the major influence of the attitudes towards sex during Shakespeare's era. And Wells recalls Measure for Measure being a tragic comedy in which the dire issue of the earlier parts of the play are suddenly resolved by bed tricks. And we see the lightheartedness in it, but the tragedy, if you will, is Claudio, a man being put to death for fornicating and impregnating a young woman named Julietta, even though he had a pre-marriage contract with her. So it was up to Isabella to save him from his death. And Isabella is a puritanical figure. We have to remember that. And it was known that in the Stratford records, it consisted of many instances of prosecutions for fornication, incontinence, which is sex outside of marriage, and straightforward adultery. And some of these cases actually did end up in pregnancy, and sex before marriage was an offense for which the culprits could be required to do public penance in church even after they were married. So, to enhance the comedy element in Measure for Measure, Shakespeare uses a lot of sexual innuendos to help lighten the tone of the tragedy. In Shakespeare's comedies, there are plenty of sexual innuendos for his audience to grasp on. I know Twelfth Night has other innuendos as well. Isabella's encounter with Lord Angelo particularly is filled with sexual innuendos in Act 2, Scene 2. And Shakespeare does this brilliant way of placing the innuendos that is really just innocent and straightforward. Maurice Charney, author of Shakespeare on Love and Lust, explains that the audience is painfully aware of the pulsing double entendre by Angelo's side. And here's a little clip I'm going to show you guys.
She speaks, and 'tis such sense that my sense breeds with it. Fare you well.
Oh, gentle, my lord, turn back.
Charney makes it very clear that Angelo's use of the word sense in the scene is what is sensible to reason, but it is also a synonym for sex. When Isabella says, "Hark, how I'll bribe you," Angelo can't believe what he is hearing, but Isabella only means that she will bribe him with such gifts that heaven shall share with you. As this sexual miscommunication builds, the audience cannot help but laugh at the confusion these characters are bringing upon each other. Now, in the tragedy of Hamlet, we surface into new waters. Reginald Rampone, author of Sexuality in the Age of Shakespeare, implies that Prince Hamlet's sexually evocative language contributes to his madness and his obsession with Ophelia's and his mother's sexuality. In one of the most memorable quotes in Hamlet, he asks Ophelia, "Are you honest?"
Are you honest?
My lord?
Are you fair?
Hamlet, of course, wants to know if she is chaste. "Get thee to a nunnery. Why wouldst thou be a breeder of sinners?" This line has been variously interpreted. Charney suggests nunnery was used ironically in Shakespeare's time to mean a brothel. Unlike Measure for Measure, tragedies consist of straightforward, suggestive language, such as Prince Hamlet mourning the death of his father and cannot help but obsess over his mother's incestuous and or hasty marriage to his uncle Claudius. The imagery begins with Hamlet comparing his father to Hyperion, the god of the sun, and Claudius to a satyr, which was half man and half goat, an image of an unbridled lust. In the same fashion, Othello is filled with imagery that contains sexual meanings. The suggestive language of Shakespeare's plays leaves space open for interpretation about each individual character. So just like the character of Hamlet, Othello is obsessed by Desdemona having an affair with Cassio, so both Hamlet and Othello have their imaginations running wild with possibilities of their women engaging in sexual activities. In Othello, Iago begins the sexual imagery of the play by attempting to create a vivid image in Desdemona's father, some sexual relations between Desdemona and Othello, when he definitively asserts, "I am one, sir, that comes to tell you your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs." It is Iago that creates the sexual imagination behind the play and feeds Othello the possibilities of Cassio and Desdemona having the affair. Rampone suggests that throughout this play, Iago possesses a voyeuristic interest in others' sexual relations. While Cassio relaxes with Iago before he is to begin with his night watch, Iago tries vainly to engage him in bawdy banter as to how Desdemona and Othello will spend their wedding night. So Iago initiates this dialogue that has like a risque comment. He hath not yet made wanton the night with her, and she is sport for Jove. But Cassio still thinks of her in a professional manner by replying, "She's a most exquisite lady." Iago insists upon using provocative language, but Cassio, who is usually thought to be a better educated and refined character than Iago, refuses to engage in inappropriate off-color banter concerning the wife of his commanding officer. Contrasting to the comedies, Othello swears that his love is purely spiritual and not physical, and that he is too old for pleasures of young love. "Vouch with me, heaven, I therefore beg it not to please the palate of my appetite." So sexual and suggestive language is always open to interpretation for readers, and this includes film and theater directors. And film and theater directors like to interpret their characters in a variety of ways. So for Measure, we have Lord Angelo, and some theater directors actually took the direction of Lord Angelo playing a monster of self-loathing rather than a monster to be loathed for his perverse thoughts. And some scholars suggest that Lord Angelo and the Duke are reflections of Queen Elizabeth, King James I, the government, and the church. And in several interpretations, we have Isabella as a very sexy and very self-possessed person, very self-possessed character, I should say. And some other interpretations could have her portray as a conservative and an innocent young woman. And if you could see here, there's a connection there too, because Isabella could be a portrayal of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth herself. And then when you tie it all back together to the tragedies, Ophelia and Desdemona can be seen and represented as women civilians that are suffering through these tragedies because of their engagement in sexual activities. And the reason they suffer in the end of these tragedies is because they're paying their dues for their wickedness in succumbing to sexual activity. Although these women are left to interpretation whether they have been completely sinful. Hamlet and Othello have had controversial interpretations when it came to sex in film. Franco Zeffirelli likes to take the sexual route into his interpretations of the plays. And you could definitely see it in Ophelia's mad scene when she becomes fully developed after the death of her father. She sexually accosts a guard with her hands that are almost like claws as she sings bawdy songs. In Act 3, Scene 4, Zeffirelli adds some Freudian interpretations of the relationship between Hamlet and his mother. And Hamlet climbs on top of her and symbolizes an eros and anger by rocking and thrusting at her in a mockery of sexual intercourse. And in the 1995 version of Othello, directed by Oliver Parker, it's unlike any other film because it takes a voyeuristic eroticism of the camera's eye, leaving no doubt as to whether Othello and Desdemona consummated their relationship. And this film version of Othello abounds in heterosexist fantasies of Othello and Desdemona and their erotic relationship, in addition to those that Othello has of Cassio with Desdemona. And this film version provides a lot of visual representation of these fantasies. So each play covers a part of the nature of sex. Measure for Measure represents the comedic miscommunication between people and the strict punishments that come with engaging in sex. Hamlet provides a look into the obsession people have with sex, and this ranges to Laertes asking Ophelia to protect her chaste treasure, to Hamlet imagining the intimacy between his mother and his uncle. Othello provides an in-depth look at the troubles of sexual imaginations and gossip. Gossip was present in the reign of King James. Wells states some of the courtiers were the objects of notorious scandals, and the king himself gave rise to gossip, even scandal because of his intimate relationships with handsome young men. Sex drives people mad with lust, but people always turn to it for a minor glimpse of love. People often confuse the love with lust, but primarily each character in Shakespeare's play encounters sex through either specific themes or through subtle innuendos. And that is it for my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys have researched, and good luck with finals. And I'll see you guys later, and have an excellent summer.